In 1865, a man called James McLaren stood up in a church in Jamaica and said this: "But now I'm still a slave by working days by days." He was born free. His parents were slaves, but he never was. So why would he say that? And just 1 month after he said this, Jamaica would erupt. It would burn. But not just because of racism, because of simple mathematics. Every day he earned 1 shilling for cutting 2,310 feet of sugarcane. On a weekly basis, that's the equivalent of $140 in today's money. But this was not a broken system. It was a perfect one. And a month later, the chapel where he said this would be burnt to the ground, and hundreds would be dead. So in 1834, Britain celebrated being like one of the most progressive countries of all time. They freed their slaves willingly. They chose to do it. But there's a little catch there. The first 4 years, so 1834 to 1838, they would have to work as apprentices. And the point was to learn how to be free. You know, they've been slaves. They haven't got to adjust to society as is, etc. And so give them a transition period. That's the argument that's being made. Of course, that's not really true, but we'll get to that later. And how much were they paid for this apprenticeship? Nothing. So you still worked for the same man who owned you before. He doesn't technically own you now, but you are forced to work for him for free. So he does still kind of own you for at least these 4 years. I say he, could be a woman as well, but mostly men. We're talking the same fields, the same overseers, the same punishments, e.g. the treadmill, and the same flogging. This lasts almost 5 years. But after that period, they're officially free. But the seeds have already been sown of what's to come. So 1838, the apprenticeship system ends. So what do the former slaves do? They've got no land, they've got no property, they've got no money, savings, etc., because they haven't been paid for, even in those 4 years, and definitely not while they were slaves. So initially, they can't do much. The plantation owners, their masters, own everything, including where they're going to live. But you know, they rent them cottages and even little plots of land where they can grow food when they're finished with their day-to-day work. So sounds nice. But the catch is that that rent is really high. I've already given you the figures earlier where James McLaren, later in the story, is going to have most of his salary taken up with rent, and that starts right from emancipation. So as a former slave, pretty much your only option was to work for a plantation. So, you know, you were probably working on the plantation as an apprentice, and before that you were probably working as a slave on that same plantation. So now you're at least being paid, so a little bit of progress. Nearly all that money, though, is going on the rent. And what if you say, I don't want to work on these plantations? Like, I've done this all my life, been brutalized and tortured and all kinds of things. They're like, fine, don't. The only other option you've got is to go work for another plantation owner, who's probably just as bad as the one that you've previously had, if you're lucky. So refusing to work on a plantation would lead to eviction and starvation, because that's the only place where you could grow food as well, was the place that you were renting. Plantation work could be brutal. So whether you really had the energy or time to grow your own food is another thing, but at least you had that option. But as soon as you couldn't pay your rent, you have no way of getting food. So they're trapped. But don't take my word for it. Wellwood Maxwell Anderson would testify to the Royal Commission that investigates the rebellion at the end of this story. And he says this: "I should be very glad if they would be dependent on my capital, but they are not. Their very independence is an evil." Bit over dramatic, but had to try and do my best 19th century British guy, right? So the former slaves know it. The plantation owners know it. The slave's only choice is which plantation to work on. So let's skip ahead a bit to when McLaren is an adult. So we know how the end of slavery happened, but now we're seeing the next generation. So he was never a slave, but he's in the same system. So McLaren works at the Coley estate, farming sugarcane, notoriously a brutal form of farming as well. And as we heard, it's about $140 a week that he's earning. And in his words, this was not enough to sustain a house full of family. Over these decades, the now freed Jamaicans were pushing to try and get better salaries, better working conditions, anything they could to improve their lives. But when they went to their former master and said, "Please, sir, can I have some more?" they said, "No. Why don't you go work somewhere else?" It's a bit like the housing situation. It's like, well, you can go somewhere else if you want, but they're going to be the same as us. And the reason they're going to be the same is because it's a conspiracy. The former planters have got together and said, do not increase their salaries, because if you do, then I'll have to do the same thing. So it's very monopolistic behavior, right? But you may think, why don't they just farm some of the unused land? And some people did that. Very smart idea. But the system already had a plan for those people. Instead, you'd get a special flat tax that was charged on you. And if you were poor, more than likely the reason you were doing this in the first place, you couldn't afford to pay it, because you were already paying all of your salary on the rent. So that way out is cut off. They can't do anything there unless they can be really sneaky. But the chances are someone's going to rat them out, or a plantation owner is going to know that it's happening and report them because they don't want them to be able to be less dependent on the plantation. Another way out, though, is what about the courts? Get some kind of justice, some kind of freedom? Seems reasonable, right? They do now have roughly equal protection under the law, in theory, but in practice, there's a trap. I'm sorry, I keep saying trap, but if you think about it, these are all traps. The trap is pretty much all of the judges are the plantation owners, so they're former masters. So do you think they're going to be impartial when they're probably bringing a case against one of their friends? And you may think this can't have been intentional, right? Like maybe this is just a series of accidents. But we have a direct quote. So this is someone who calls themselves a 30 years resident of Jamaica. It's an anonymous pamphlet that's sent around. But they say this: the goal was to assimilate their freedom as nearly as possible to slavery. So pretty much a smoking gun. And they were doing a good job, because that's what it looks like. So this resentment is growing amongst the former slaves and their children and the subsequent generations. They were promised freedom, and it doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like they've been tricked. And they have. So some people outside Jamaica knew this was happening. You'd have colonial officials, and they would report into the colonial office, and they would hear of the complaints about all of these things. But they said, this can't be right. It doesn't sound that bad, does it? They say it's not a systemic problem. It's the workers. They just don't really have the work ethic. A bit lazy. Have you ever heard of that about black people? On the 13th of November, 1865, the Times had this: the Negro has been able to live with little or no work because he could subsist on a patch of land readily. So framing their independence as laziness. So as that frustration is building, you could try and do some kind of organized labor. So as that tension is building between the two sides, the Jamaicans do start to think, what do we do to put pressure on them? Like, there's no way out so far, so maybe we just refuse to work, It's the beginnings of the eras of labour action, I guess, before unions really become a thing. But just in case those Jamaicans get a bit too uppity, we've got this other colony, India. Don't know if you've ever heard of it. Lots of people. There's China has a lot of people as well. And we've got a lot of influence there after a few little colonial wars. Why don't we just bring loads of workers from those places to Jamaica? Problem solved. That means any Jamaican who refuses to work for that price won't be able to get work, because they'll just replace him with an Indian or Chinese worker who's basically been semi-enslaved to go work in Jamaica or other places in the Caribbean. So after over 30 years of slavery being over, but not the apprentice system, wages are still at starvation levels. People can not afford to live. People in charge on the island definitely aren't doing anything to help them. The colonial office is definitely not doing anything to help them. So they choose to go above the government's head, as in the UK government's head. In April 1865, 108 people have had enough of this. They're in St. Anne's Parish in Jamaica. They're poor, and they write a letter directly to Queen Victoria. They say, we can't afford to live. We're in extreme poverty. Please do something to help us. The main thing they want, and it's quite a simple thing really, is there's lots of crown land on Jamaica that isn't actually owned by the plantation owners. Why don't they just remove those taxes that stop them growing on there and let them use it for food? And that would allow them to be a bit more independent and not have to work basically for free. Not a crazy demand, right? But we know where this is going. They're not going to say yes. 4 months go by, and then in August 1865, the Colonial Office responds with a letter that's now known as the Queen's Advice. Of course, the Queen probably didn't write it, but it's in her name. It is her government. So Secretary Edward Cardwell works at the Colonial Office, and he's the one who drafts the message. And this little quote, I think, sums it up. Prosperity depends on working for wages, steadily and continuously. So, no land, no reform of the system that they're in. Just get on with it. So now they've tried everything legal, pretty much. The feedback loop is broken. In these kind of democratic institutions, you're meant to be able to feed back to the people who represent you. And you're also meant to be able to use courts to defend yourself. And you're also meant to be able to fight to get more money. All of these things have been blocked to them. And so the pressure just rises and rises. If you think of this as almost like a pressure cooker, we're getting to the point where the lid is starting to rattle. And the last real thing that could have been done to cool everything down was the response to that letter. And they chose ignorance. And on the 11th of October, 1865, the match is lit that ignites the rebellion. Paul Bogle turns up with a group of Jamaicans in Morant Bay outside the courthouse. They're armed. They're ready for a fight if it gets to that. But they're there to show they're not going to take it anymore. The reason we know how much James McLaren earned and how little he had left is because it was Paul Bogle's church that he said it in, where the Jamaicans had got together and said, enough is enough, we need to do something. They were determined, if they could, to break free of colonial control, both from the state, as in the British Empire itself, and from the church, the Anglican Church, because it's just an arm of the British state, really. The magistrate walks out with some militiamen and orders them to go home. He reads them the Riot Act. They refuse to leave. He orders the militiamen to shoot at them. There's more of them than the militiamen. They charge at them. They retreat into the courthouse. 18 people die, including the magistrate, Baron von Ketterholt. In response, the governor of Jamaica orders martial law over eastern Jamaica, which is where this is happening. And he blames outside agitators. He says ignorant black people are being misled by them. So they can't think for themselves, apparently. And he has a very particular person in mind that he wants to make sure gets punished for this. Not James McLaren, but George William Gordon, a mixed-race man who lives in Kingston, not in eastern Jamaica. So he's not at the riot. He can't be. And they know that. But they want him because of who he is. He's not just any old person. He's a member of the Jamaican House of Assembly. So yeah, he's someone with power. And he uses that power to advocate for the poor. So in their eyes, he's the one who's led these poor Jamaicans to rise up against the British. Because they can't think for themselves, apparently. So yeah, he's in Kingston. Civil law still applies in Kingston because martial law is only declared in eastern Jamaica and Kingston isn't there. So what do? They have him arrested. They put him on a boat, HMS Wolverine, and transport him to Morant Bay. And why would they do that? So they can move him into the martial law zone. And why would you do that? So you can execute him without a proper trial. And on the 23rd of October 1865, he was hanged. And now before he was executed, he wrote to his wife and explained that he didn't deserve it. Of course, I don't think anyone really deserved it, but that's my opinion. But definitely not him. He couldn't be more innocent. But clearly they knew they were setting an example. Don't speak up for the poor, or you might end up like this guy. There's no doubt about it. Gordon was judicially murdered for speaking up for people like McLaren. He heard their stories and he raised them with people who mattered. And this was his reward. But you don't think Governor Eyre is just going to let it lie with one man, do you? Just one man punished for 18 colonizers? No. At the very least, 469 people are executed immediately after. It's a disputed number, partially because not all of the executions were recorded properly. So it's more likely to be over 500. I've seen estimates of over 1,000. We don't truly know. But still, 500 people, at least, were probably murdered as a result of this. A further 600 men and women were flogged publicly. They marched to where these people live, and they burn it all down. Over 1,000 dwellings completely burned to the ground. Many of these dwellings were in free villages, so the little slices of land people had managed to sneak away to get out of the plantation system. They burnt it to the ground so they could no longer escape. Can't make it up, can you? And the number one target they had, the number one place they definitely wanted to burn down, was Paul Bogle's town, specifically his church, where McLaren had given that speech that riled everyone up. They were sending a message, and it was very, very clear. It went far beyond crushing a rebellion. If you could say that that was justified legally in some way, they chose punishment, and collective punishment, which, as we know, is now illegal under international law, even though certain states do it all the time. A lot of people die. They lose their homes, their source of food, any slither of independence they felt they really had. They were being punished. They were being put back in their place. They were being pushed further back towards slavery. And they couldn't just let the place where the rebellion started stand as though nothing had happened. And so we go back to James McLaren, the man who called himself a slave in that church. He was one of those at least 469 people that were executed. He was hung at the courthouse. And in some ways, this was inevitable. You may think, it can't have been surely. No, this specific event, no. That this Morant Bay on the 11th of October, no, there's no guarantee that this would have happened. But if we look at everything that got us to this point, something was going to happen. And the British closed their ears to it until it was too late, and then reacted furiously. And a lot of people died because of that lack of a feedback loop. So let's quickly retread it. They had no land, no leverage. Rent took nearly all of it. Any form of escape was criminalized or taxed, so you were even poorer. The corruption of the judiciary that was really run by the same people who were their employers. So there was no chance they were going to get any change out of them. And when they finally rose up, the rebellion was crushed by the might of the British Empire. And the man who dared to speak up was hung. But I just want to make one thing really clear. There are a lot of bad people in this story, but I don't think this happened just because they were bad people. This was a systemic problem. They had grown used to free labour. The only way they felt they could make money was to have people paid almost nothing. So they did whatever they could after having the concession of having slavery ended to keep salaries and wages as low as humanly possible. And they're not really humanly possible because the people had to starve as a result. An intentional trap was created to make sure they wouldn't have any freedom. Give them a little bit of freedom, a little bit of reform. And they refused to do it. So McLaren definitely was not confused when he called himself a slave. He chose to say it out loud and they killed him for it. 1857 in India to 1865 in Jamaica that led to bitter divides in British society. A rivalry between Charles Dickens and Charles Darwin. Watch this to see how rebellions in the colonies led to bitter divides. Bye.